Welcome, nutritionradio.org listeners. This is Lonnie Lowry, the University Nutrition Professor of over 20 years and podcast host of long-running shows like Iron Radio. Come on in. Fitness Fridays. Hey everybody. Today I would like to challenge you to think about weight loss completely differently. This is something I've actually shown and discussed in detail in beginner exercise physiology classes, and I really hope it gives you a new perspective on weight loss, on fat loss, etc. Now, some of you may have seen this before. There was a TEDx talk by Ruben Meerman, and he just does a brilliant job of physically showing you where the weight that you lose goes. He started by actually interviewing a bunch of people and asked them something simple. Where does all that fat that was in your love handles or your gut or wherever you're storing it, where'd it go? And people are like, well, it just sort of becomes energy. It just releases into the ether. They're saying all these different things because they're just not aware of this basic chemical principle, right? Principle in chemistry, which is the conservation of mass. That when you eat, you store fat in long carbon chains. You store carbon as carbohydrates as well. C6H12O6, glucose and units become glycogen, etc. But the guy is a physicist, and he just looks at this in an ecosystem kind of way. Plants take carbon dioxide, take carbon from the air, use the energy from the sun to make starches, to make carbohydrates that we can then eat. Some plants make fats, of course, as well. Then when we exercise or just have resting metabolism, or resting metabolic rate, we breathe out CO2 with every breath. So we take the fuels that we had stored, those carbon-based fuels, and we exhale them as CO2. And what he does that's so brilliant is he just takes this stoichiometric approach, right? He just looks at all the carbons and hydrogens and oxygens in the fuels that are stored, and then he shows you them on the breath. So if you look at this, he takes a human triglyceride, so C55H1O4O6, plus or minus a little, but that's generally the formula for human fat, plus 78 oxygen, and then you produce 55 CO2 and 52 water, H2O, through metabolism. Now, those 55 carbon dioxides, if you've had a basic kind of physiology class, you know that the Krebs cycle is sort of a central wheel of metabolism. It's always turning. It's accepting acetyl-CoA from fats and carbohydrates. And as this central wheel turns, it sort of emits CO2. So the way I kind of jokingly say, half jokingly, is CO2 flies off of this wheel. So CO2 comes off. In fact, even if you're using carbohydrates as the fuel, even as it enters this central metabolic wheel, the Krebs cycle, the TCA, whatever you want to call it, even the entrance as pyruvate, that pyruvate releases another carbon dioxide as it makes acetyl-CoA, which is the fuel that enters the Krebs cycle. Not to bore you, but the idea here is that this CO2 is constantly bleeding away of the Krebs cycle. So the Krebs cycle would sort of wear away if we didn't keep feeding acetyl-CoAs into it, if we didn't keep feeding these two carbon fuel molecules from carbs and fats. So this CO2 that's flying off, both the linking pathway from the carbohydrates as they come in, or just from the Krebs cycle itself, again, the majority of the ATP that your body makes comes from this cooperation with the Krebs cycle and what's called the respiratory chain, the electron transport chain. But the idea here is that the CO2 does have mass. So where do those love handles go? The carbons come off in minuscule, tiny amounts of CO2 when you breathe out. In fact, he did some math. He had lost some weight. He was losing 85 grams a day. And again, this is largely the carbons in the CO2. And yeah, you can add in the weights of the hydrogens and the oxygens as well, because those are going to form the H2O and the CO2, right? The water and the carbon dioxide that are on your breath. I think the real winning move that he does is that he exhales into a balloon. And it doesn't look like there's any mass in there. It's just sort of invisible. But then he freezes it, and he gets it just to the right temperature that the CO2 comes out of the air, right, the gaseous form, and becomes a solid. And he can shake the balloon and show it to you. It's remarkable. So this idea that like 10 kilograms of fat loss, so a little over 20 pounds of fat loss, 10 kilograms of fat loss becomes 8.4 kilograms of CO2. You don't know it's there because it's invisible in the gas. But that's remarkable to me. As a physiologist, when I would do my uphill fasted walking before breakfast, I like that direct fat burning approach. Again, there's different ways to do it. But what I like about it is I could look on a metabolic chart at something called the RER, the respiratory exchange ratio. I won't bore you, but the point is I knew that with every exhale, there goes the CO2 that used to be the aliphatic chains, the carbon chains of fat, of fatty acids that I had mobilized, and I was breaking apart and burning. It was extracting the energy to move my muscles and exercise, but I was releasing that CO2 in the air. So every breath, CO2 that used to be fat. I know it used to be fat and not necessarily carbohydrate, if that even matters to you, because of the intensity and the fasted state, etc., of the exercise. But not until I saw his video did I see the CO2 as a white powder, and I thought that is just brilliant. So anyway, that's just a quick little, I guess, push for you to go check out this video. I'll leave a link on YouTube, or just do a search. If you were to type in the mathematics of weight loss, this is just a brilliant way to look at this, because I think, and I agree with him, that we have really confused the heck out of people with this idea of calories in, calories out. I do it myself. When in fact, we're really looking at the carbons. It's a personal carbon economy that we're talking about. The carbons that you consume from the foods that you eat, and then the carbons that you emit on your breath. Everybody knows you breathe out CO2. It's just amazing to be able to see it. If this is at all confusing to you, maybe I'll do a clip from my actual classroom lecture where I was talking about this a little bit more. It really helps to look at some visuals, though, and we're not going to do that in an audio podcast. But if fat loss has ever mystified you, this is a great way to physically see the weight, even on an atomic level, come and go. It also shows you why the time frames for fat loss tend to be fairly long when you exercise, right? Which is, I mean, he was talking about 85 grams per day that he lost. Well, there's 454 grams in 1 pound. So what's that, like a fifth of a pound each day? And again, not just through the exercise, but the resting metabolic rate, which is most of the CO2 that you emit during the day. But yeah, so eating less carbon and exercising more to blow off more carbon. If it's about a fifth of a pound, you see he's losing a pound about every 5 days. That math works out pretty well with what we normally recommend. And I love that this guy, he quickly points out you can't just hyperventilate and try to breathe off more CO2. You actually have to mobilize the fat, right? Break up the triglycerides that you store in your love handles and your fat cells. Release the fatty acids. Feed those into working muscle, into the little mitochondria powerhouses, and that's where the Krebs cycles are, and that's where all the burning takes place. So you've actually got to raise your metabolic rate by burning fuels. You can't just sit around and hyperventilate. Okay, but that's going to be it for today. I just wanted to give you this different idea. Instead of energy coming and going, the idea that it's literally physical things. It's carbon. It's your own personal carbon economy that is driving fat loss. And once you know that, it seems sort of matter of fact. He certainly seemed this way, like, oh, I eat less carbon and I'll try to move around more and blow off more carbon. It's just kind of a refreshing way to look at it. So, and if nothing, I mean, that's what podcasts should do, I think. If they're educational and science related, give you a new way to look at something that's valid. That's going to be it for this time. We'll see you later. The NutritionRadio.org podcast is for informational purposes only. If you're interested in starting a diet or exercise program, check with your physician, nutritionist, or qualified exercise physiologist in order to make the progress that you need.